Welcome to the European Parliamentary Research Service podcasts.
As the European Council's role and influence have increased over the past years, fueled by the various crises the EU has had to face, so has the need for scrutiny. European Parliament resolutions are one way of doing that. But what other tools does the Parliament have, or should have, to increase democratic oversight of the European Council? Stay with us.
Under the pressure of the financial crisis, the COVID pandemic, or the most recent war in Ukraine, the European Council, which represents EU member states in Brussels, has expanded its influence over policy-making and has de facto assumed executive powers not assigned to it by the treaties.
As the only democratically elected EU institution, the European Parliament has sounded the alarm bell about this growing institutional imbalance and called for measures to remedy it. But what powers does the European Parliament hold over the European Council?
While the Parliament has several instruments to hold the Commission and its President accountable, like censoring it through a vote of confidence, it can't do the same with the European Council and its President.
Having said that, it does have some tools to scrutinise the activities of the European Council. For example, the plenary debates organised with the President of the European Council after its meetings, which give MEPs a chance to scrutinise results.
Members of the European Parliament can also send written questions to the President of the European Council, a practice that started with the first full-time President, Herman Van Rompuy, and has been maintained by both of his successors, Donald Tusk and Charles Michel.
But perhaps one of the most effective ways for the Parliament to express its views on the EU political process and scrutinise the work of the European Council is through its resolutions. Unlike the plenary debates and the written questions, resolutions represent the Parliament's majority view, and not only that of individual MEPs or political groups.
There are three types of resolutions: legislative ones adopted under the ordinary procedure, resolutions adopted in the budgetary procedure, and non-legislative ones, which Parliament adopts on its own initiative, allowing it to address any topic it considers relevant.
So how often does the Parliament address the European Council in its resolutions? And what are the main topics and messages they contain? Stay with us.
Of the 2,337 resolutions adopted by the Parliament during the last term, only 162 of them addressed the European Council in a meaningful way. Some of them originated directly from the plenary, others from committees dealing with topics that are often discussed by the European Council, like foreign affairs, economic and budgetary matters, and constitutional affairs. However, only a fifth of these resolutions call on the EP President to forward them to the EU leaders.
Now back to the topics addressed. One of the most frequent concerns the EU institutional architecture, and here the Parliament has raised three main issues in relation to the European Council: the need to formalise the lead candidates process, the need to address the growing institutional imbalance due to the European Council's power grip, and to increase its transparency.
The Parliament has also used its resolutions to express its support for the enlargement process and encourage the European Council to grant candidate status to applicant countries, as was the case with Ukraine and Moldova.
Other topics covered in these resolutions are the EU's annual and pluriannual budgets, external relations, and the need for EU reforms to keep the machine working smoothly and democratically.
But the Parliament's resolutions not only differ by topic, but also regarding their messages, the most common being to call on the European Council to take action, be it in relation to the lead candidates process, to address the lack of transparency in the European Council, changes in the institutional framework that the Parliament sees necessary, or calling on the European Council to move forward in relation to the enlargement.
The Parliament also uses its resolutions to comment, often more negatively than positively, on the European Council's activities. Here's Ralf Drakenberg from the European Parliamentary Research Service.
Parliament has repeatedly criticized the growing institutional imbalance, arguing that the European Council has taken a number of important political decisions outside of the treaty framework, thereby de facto excluding those decisions from the oversight of Parliament. In the area of budget, Parliament has called on the European Council and the Council to have separate budgets to improve transparency. On the EU's long-term budget, Parliament has also criticized the European Council regarding its in-depth involvement in the multi-annual financial framework procedure and for adopting very detailed conclusions on this, limiting the room for negotiations between Parliament and Council.
And sometimes the Parliament uses resolutions simply to make a neutral statement, for instance to take note of the European Council's activity or to inform the heads of state or government about its own activities.
So looking at the way in which Parliament's resolutions have been used in the past, what changes would be necessary in order to increase scrutiny over the European Council?
Well, a first step would be to forward them more systematically to the European Council. Another way to increase its influence on the workings of the European Council would be to adopt resolutions either ahead of or immediately after EU summits to comment on its results.
Crafting more precise messages to the EU leaders, better specifying which tools it would need to strengthen its scrutiny powers, would also increase its clout. But there are other ideas in addition to fine-tuning the current use of resolutions.
For example, formalizing the relationship between the two in an interinstitutional agreement, or strengthening cooperation with national parliaments to better scrutinise the activities of their leaders in Brussels.
More specifically, about the President of the European Council, the Parliament has no say in their election. However, it could hold a symbolic vote on the President-elect and make sure he or she attends the pre-summit plenary debates to exchange views and increase cooperation between the two institutions.
So, there's no shortage of ideas, but it is rather a question of political will.
Want to know more? Check out the full brief by Ralf Drakenberg and Pavel Bachel on the EPRS website or in our app.
This is a European Parliamentary Research Service podcast.
Thanks for listening.